welcome back to D&D's Garage. I'm your host Dan. As always, behind the camera is my son Victor. He's Kaiju Cam on YouTube and That One Grunt on TikTok. We thought we'd do a technical video. Like I told you guys before, we would try and get into actually showing you some working on cars stuff. As it happens, we need to do lower control arm bushings on our 1968 Dart because it is deeply dangerous to drive, and I've been chasing toe adjustments around without any success. I purchased a front end kit for this car quite a few years ago, anticipating using newer style ball joints and newer style strut rod bushings. So through the video, I'll show you some differences between the older 67 to 72 A-body Dodges and the 73 to 76 Mopar A-bodies as well, because there's one thing that can really get you into trouble. And I've just seen recently, 2 days ago, posts on the forums. Guys have bought the front end kits and they have the bushings for the wrong strut rod. So anyways, we'll get into that later on. So for right now, we're going to start pulling the front end apart. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is take the nut off the tie rod end. You can see the cotter pin is already removed. So it's a 3/4 inch socket. So we're going to ugga that off. Next thing we're going to need to do is to remove the tie rod end from the steering arm. So you'll see that I've put the nut back on. I usually put it on just a few threads. No, we're not going to hit the end of the nut or anything like that. It's just so that the tie rod doesn't drop completely out and I don't fall on my face when I take this out. So I'm going to put some pressure between the steering arm and the tie rod with this pry bar and get a lot of pressure on it, and then I'm going to smack the steering arm. Believe it or not, this is actually the proper way to do this. Sometimes people get a little freaked out when you use a hammer, but this is actually right in factory service manuals. So if you're doing this yourself, pro tip, put the nut on so the tie rod doesn't go to the ground and your face doesn't either, and hit the side of the steering arm. You can use the pullers, but I do find this method works much more quickly and much more effectively. Okay? There we go. And as you can see, no damage to our dust boot or anything like that. We'll just leave our tie rod sitting there. I'll put the nut back for safekeeping. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do before we go any further in disassembling the suspension is to loosen off the bolt on the bottom side of the lower control arm. That bolt, when it's tightened up, applies twist to the torsion bar, which is actually the spring for the front of the car, on pretty much all of the Mopar cars from the late 50s up into the 70s. So my wonderful cameraman is risking life and limb to get under the car to show you where that bolt is. It's critical that you undo that bolt now before you take apart the rest of the suspension, so that you don't have things springing around and causing you a lot of anxiety and potentially moving and hurting you. Okay, so I'm going to get underneath there. We'll switch spots and we'll come back after. Underneath here, we're going to loosen the torsion bar. So what I like to do is set up my ratchet or your breakover bar you could use as well, so I can get 1/2 turn out of this. And what we want to do is we want to count the number of turns that we loosen the bolt. To get it completely loose for removing the control arm, on most cars, it's probably going to be somewhere around 30 turns. So I won't bore you guys with watching all of that. I'll loosen this off and then we'll come back after that. Okay, all the way off so that there's no tension whatsoever on the torsion bar applied. So I'm going to let Victor get out of there, and then when we come back, we'll show you taking apart the bolts for the spindles. Okay? Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take the brake caliper off and hang that safely up out of the way. I've got a piece of filler rod from my TIG welder that I'm going to use as a hook here, and I've bent it up so I can hang it around the top of the shock and hold the caliper up over here. We'll do that before we disconnect the lower ball joint from the spindle. So I'll do that right now on camera here for you guys, so you can see me sit on the struggle bus just like everybody else. There we go. So we've got that there. You can use a coat hanger or whatever you like, but the big thing is to get your brake caliper supported so it's not hanging by the hose. When I was a young lad, I definitely did that a few times and had some brake hose failures later on, which makes for a pretty exciting drive, but not recommended. Really, really dangerous. So these are really simple brakes. 2 bolts hold the caliper on, and these 2 spring-loaded plates. You want to make sure that you note their orientation when you take them off. And then we'll use our pry bar to just gently pop this up off the mount. So key thing here is try not to manhandle the brake pads themselves so you don't get your any grease or oil on them. When you reassemble everything, make sure that you clean your brake pads and clean your rotor when you're done. Okay, so that gets that up and out of the way, and I think we should be in good shape. Let's make sure that when this comes down it won't hurt it. And then we're going to turn our attention to this nut right here, which is our lower ball joint nut. And same concept applies. I'm going to take the nut out. I'm going to try and apply some pressure, and I'm going to try and get a clear shot to smack that piece of forged iron there so that it will release the taper on the ball joint. So we'll bring you back after I've got that. So we're back, and through the magic of video editing, you guys have missed about 1,000 cuss words and lots of sweating. So we've got the ball joint free. We've got the nut still sitting on there so it doesn't fall completely out. You'll notice that I put the jack under the lower control arm. That's so we can provide some upper pressure to the control arm, and the spindle and the control arm, upper control arm, will provide weight so that once we were done smashing really hard this piece of iron here, the ball joint would free, but everything wouldn't fall down. So next thing I'm going to do is take this nut off, and I'm going to take this lower bolt out of the shock so we can get the whole lower control arm free. So I'll bring you back after that. So I've got the shock disconnected. I've got the nut off of the lower ball joint. You can see that the spindle's fallen down. Now it's out of the way. So now we're going to just slowly lower down the lower control arm. Critical when you do put the jack under the lower control arm, make sure that you're not lifting your car up off of your jack stands, because you don't want it to be a dangerous situation. Okay, so we've got our spindle completely free. Our control arm is mostly free. Now we've got to disconnect the camber strut rod, which you can see the back end of right here. So this is what it looks like. This is actually the newer style, 73 to 76, which we need to work with our new bushings. So I'm going to undo this bolt here. On the other end, we've got a nut and, this nut here. On the other end, we've got a nut and washers holding it into the front of the cross member. So I'll get those undone, and then we'll bring you back, and then after that, we'll move to the back of the torsion bar. We have to remove a clip so we can allow the torsion bar to slide back and the control arm to slide out of the cross member after we take off the lower control arm pivot bolt, pivot nut, and we'll show you that as well. So we'll be right back after these short messages. So for some reason our lapel mic didn't work, but what we're showing you there is the nut for the lower control arm pivot shaft, which Victor's taking off so you can get a good look at. And then after that we're going to move forward on the car to get the nut off of the caster strut. And once all of that's done, we'll let Victor out from under the car, and I'll go underneath and remove the clip from the torsion bar, which we'll show you guys in a few minutes. And then I'm going to move the whole assembly rearward in the car and take it out, and we'll work on it on the bench. So hopefully this disjointed audio doesn't drive you guys a little bit crazy. Sorry for that, technical difficulties, but we're working on it. So I'm just Okay, so next we have the torsion bar, and we're going to remove this clip here. That's going to allow us to slide the torsion bar rearward in the car along with the lower control arm assembly, and we'll be able to take everything out. Okay, so next we're going to take our nut off of our strut rod, put that away, and I'm going to go underneath, and I'm going to persuade the lower control arm back, and the torsion bar will slide out the back of the torsion bar cross member now that we've got the clip. So now we've slid the lower control arm back, the torsion bar is moved back. Might have to move our steering linkage out of the way, but you can see this is free. So the next thing we'll do is actually take the lower control arm out of the car. We'll leave the torsion bar hanging in the cross member, and I'll show you the lower control arm bushing and what we're going to replace when we come back. Okay, so we've got the control arm out of the car, so you can see that this is the way it was in the car before. So that would be the front of the car. That's where we had the nut in the cross member there, and the torsion bar fit in the back. So how this works is this bushing is supposed to look like this, where we've got a hardened steel insert, rubber between the two, and a hardened steel shell. This is pretty typical for what you'd find in these older cars once they've got a bunch of miles. You got to bear in mind that this is a 1968 car, so I guess that's 43 years? No? Oh my goodness. What is it? Is it 53 years? I think it might be 43 years. Yeah. Anyways, so the rubber's all completely pushed out of the one area. So that explains why the car was handling so weirdly. Plus the control arm pivot pin is pushed out a little bit further than we'd like it to be, and this nut was actually really loose. So what we're going to do, we're going to push this pin out. We can get out the back end of the pin through this hole here. You can actually see the edge of that hardened steel shell right there. So we're going to push the pin out, but instead of pressing another one of these guys in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to burn all the rubber out of this outer shell, leave it in place in the control arm, and we're going to install this polyurethane bushing. So the reason we want to do the polyurethane bushing in our case is we want durability, and we want a complete lack of deflection as much as possible in the lower control arm, while still offering a tiny bit of cushion. Now, one caveat to these guys is they tend to squeak. They actually make a new lower control arm pivot that actually has a grease fitting in the end, and it's rifle drilled in behind, so it provides grease to this area. We don't have that, so I'm going to generously apply this Teflon grease inside the bushing, and when I press it in there, I'll be able to press this in probably by hand, or at worst case scenario with a couple of taps of the hammer. So what I'm going to do is take this all apart. I'll burn all the rubber out. I'll show you guys everything cleaned up, and then I'll show you I'll show you one thing. I was talking about the strut rods before. So the one on the top here is our one from our 1968 or a 67 to 72 A body, and the bottom one is our 73 to 76. So the most notable difference is the location of the shoulder where the washer goes, where it goes against the bushing that sits in the front of the cross member. You can see that that's considerably further back on the newer strut rod, plus it has a different nut. So if you're going to do this swap, make sure that you get all of the hardware, and you'll also notice that the overall length of the rods is pretty much the same, just with the major difference being in the shoulder of the front. So you can see that right there. Both rods are lined up perfectly on the back because they both go into the lower control arm the same way, but the front, which is the same length, has a shoulder further up on the earlier car. Okay, so that's it for tech tips. I will get this all pulled apart, get all the rubber burnt out, get this cleaned up, and I'll bring you back. This will take probably another 40 minutes or so. So I'll do all of this off camera, and I'll bring you back when I have everything cleaned out and we're ready to reassemble this greasy junk. Okay, so we're back, and you can see that I've burnt out most of the rubber so that I could reuse the external shell of the original bushing and the internal shell, which is here now. So now we're going to lubricate this and put it back together. We want to be fairly generous with this. So what I like to do is get a whole bunch in here. This here. There. Make sure there's lots of this Teflon grease in here. It probably still won't stop it from squeaking, to be honest with you. But whatever, that's the price you pay if you want to have a little bit more solid front suspension in our old classic cars. Okay, so really, honestly, once we do this right, this should just go all the way in by hand. I'm going to do something, big no-no. Should never really tap on anything with threads. But okay, check the back here. We still got a ways to go. So I'm going to not bore you guys with me hitting something with a hammer, and we'll be right back. Okay, so before we put the lower control arm in, we've got to deal with the strut rod bushing. So what I'm going to show you guys right now is this is the old bushing here that was going through the frame. So this would have been the back side of it that faced back towards the control arm. So I popped it out of the frame. Our new one is a two-piece bushing with a steel sleeve. So this is polyurethane. And as I said before, this is for the new style strut rod. We're going to use the new style strut rod just for demonstration purposes. So the old rod, we had a concave washer this way and another one on the front. And then we had our big nut, and we would have everything installed in the car. Once the car was resting on its own weight, then we would tighten this nut completely to its proper torque spec. With the new style rod, the rear washer, according to the instructions that come with the new bushing, goes this way. And then we have our one side of our bushing, and this shoulder is exactly the size of the frame in here, where we were before, and then the other one goes right here. Sorry, I guess with our sleeve on. The other one goes here on the front, and then our front washer goes like that, and then our nut goes on like that. So I'm going to go ahead and install this in the frame. I just wanted you guys to see how it is put together, and it's a little bit hard to do when I'm underneath the car. So I'm going to put this in place, and then we're going to get our lower control arm under the car, and we'll get started on the installation process, and we'll bring you back for that. So I've got the lower control arm slid in and the torsion bar slid back in. I've actually been to the back of the car and put the clip on. So now I'm just putting in the nut for the front of the control arm pivot. So what I did was I made sure to get the strut rod set up in the car first, and then slid the control arm onto that. Then I tightened this bolt because there's a shoulder inside the strut rod that gets kind of pressed into the control arm. And so I made sure to tighten that nut, just use the old Ugga and tightened it down so that this wouldn't turn, so that when I put everything back together, the rod won't turn when I tighten the nuts. So what we're going to do is I'm going to just finish reassembling all of this. I'll put all of this back together. You've seen me take it apart. And then when we're done, I'm going to put the car on the ground. And the final step is that we do the final tighten on the strut rods with all the weight of the car on the wheels, so that we can be sure that the caster is correct for the strut rod. Okay, so we'll bring you back. So we're back. We've got the front end put together. So right now, we've got the car down on the tires. It's still sitting up a little bit funny. Anybody who knows old Mopars, or probably old cars in general, knows that you have to kind of drive it a little bit anyways, just to get the suspension to settle. So what I'm doing right now is just tightening the strut rod to 52 foot-pounds. That's the spec given to us by the manufacturer of the polyurethane bushings. And once we're done, then the next step will be to get the suspension settled and recheck camber and toe. So you guys don't need to watch me turn two bolts for half an hour, but just wanted to give you an idea that this is not a super hard process. We did it over the course of the day, including stopping for Thanksgiving dinner, and this will be edited up soon, and you'll be watching it before the end of the Canadian Thanksgiving long weekend. So thank you guys very much. Really appreciate you stopping by the channel, and if you like what we're doing, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks. Bye.